Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. What I'm going to be covering in today's episode is I'm going to begin the process of level sanding, polish sanding, and then buffing the clear coat finish on my 6-string multi-scale fan fret guitar body. Now, when I applied the finish in the last episode, and if you missed that, I'll put a link up above that. You can go back and watch it. I applied about 5 to 6 coats of Z-Epoxy finishing resin as my clear coat. Now, there's really several ways that you can apply the resin. One is to mix it up and pour it onto the surface and then spread it around with your fingers. Of course, you need to wear gloves when you do that. Or you can brush it on. The viscosity is too thick to spray it, so it has to be applied manually. Now, when you use a brush, you run the risk of beating air bubbles into the resin, and those air bubbles will dry in the resin. Then when it comes time to level sand it and polish sand it, you can expose those air bubbles as little pinholes. So I prefer to use just my fingers, and that's what I did. I applied each coat over the surface with my fingers, let it dry, and I continued until I'd built up the 6 coats. The problem is when you apply it that way, the surface can have a very rough, lumpy, wavy, bumpy texture to it. And if I want to buff this to a high gloss mirror-like shine, I need to make sure that the surface is absolutely level. And to do that, I'm going to use a process where I level sand it first, and then I follow that with polish sanding before I go to the buffer. Now the process of level sanding is going to begin by using a P240 grit sandpaper. Now this is a product from Eagle Abrasives. They sell it under their Kovacs name, and I'll put a link to all the different products in the description down below if you'd like to check out the products yourself. But like I said, this is a P240 grit. The P means it's a European designation, and I like the European designation because the abrasive grains that are used in the sandpaper are more consistent in their size. As a result, the scratch pattern they leave is more consistent, and it's therefore much easier to remove during the polish sanding process. So I'm going to begin by using the P240 grit, and I'm going to wrap the sandpaper around a block of wood. And this particular block of wood is just a piece of scrap mahogany that I sanded flat, and then I rounded over the edges and corners so that it won't gouge the surface as I'm sanding. But I'll wrap the sandpaper around this, and then I will sand the surface. And the goal here is to reduce the highest spots in the finish so that they are level with the lowest spots. And what that does is ultimately, when I go to buff it later on, the surface will have a mirror-like shine. And when I say mirror-like, it needs to reflect light and everything else that reflects off the surface perfectly. There can be no waviness, no squiggly reflections or anything like that. It needs to be a perfect mirror-like reflection. Whenever I see a shiny guitar that has reflections that are wavy or squiggly, that to me is a sign of a poor quality buffing job. So I try to strive for that perfect reflection. And it starts with that level sanding process. But once I have finished with the P240, oh, and I should mention, there may be some areas in the surface that are too lumpy and rough to level with the 240 grit. I have a piece of, or a sheet of P180 grit that I can step down to if necessary in those spots. But then once I finished sanding with the P180, I would then use the P240 because I want to make sure that the entire surface is covered with a consistent scratch pattern before I move on to the polish sanding. And speaking of polish sanding, when I get to that stage, I'm going to switch to another product from Eagle Abrasives. It's under their Kovacs brand. It's called Super Acylex. And Super Acylex is a very high-tech sanding abrasive. It comes in grits that range from 240 all the way up to 3000 grit. However, it uses what's known as a K designation rather than the P designation. And that's a different type of grading system. And basically what that means in a nutshell is, for example, if I was to sand the surface with the K800 grit, it actually is going to sand as fast as a 600 grit. However, it's going to leave a scratch pattern that is equal to 800 grit when hand sanding. If I were to machine sand, it would be equal to 1000 grit. So that's why it's a high-tech finish. It's as fast as a coarser grit, but it leaves a scratch pattern that's equal to the grit or higher. And what's also nice about it is that the scratch pattern that it leaves is much shallower than an equivalent grade of sandpaper in just a regular sandpaper. So when I sand with, like an 800 grit, the scratch pattern is going to be much shallower. So when I step up to the 1000 grit, it's going to be much easier to replace those 800 grit scratches with 1000 grit scratches. And that's really the whole goal of polish sanding. With level sanding, we're sanding with a coarse grit to get the surface level. But then with polish sanding, we're already level, so what we're trying to do is reduce the severity of the scratches. That way we will move from a 240 grit to 360, 600, 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, 2500, and then finally 3000. So we're replacing each of the previous grits scratches with the grit that we're currently sanding with. And by the time we reach 3000 grit, the surface is starting to look like a mirror and the scratches have been almost completely eliminated. From there, it's just a simple matter of taking it to the buffing machine to bring up the high gloss shine. So that's the basic process in a nutshell. Let me bring you in closer and I'll let you kind of watch as I start actually level sanding and then polish sanding the surface of this guitar. Okay, so I've got my 240 grit sandpaper wrapped around my sanding block, and I'm just going to begin sanding the surface. And one thing you'll begin to notice is I have these areas where it's flat and dull. Those are the areas that are in contact with the sandpaper, so they immediately get dull. The other areas in between are the shiny spots, and those are low spots. So what we want to do is we want to try to make the entire surface uniform in this sort of flat matte appearance here. Once we've done that, we know we've got the surface level. Now I find it's easy just to kind of work in sections. And I have the guitar sitting on a piece of carpet. And the reason I like to use the carpet is because every so often, when you're dry sanding, the sandpaper will get clogged up. So I just simply wipe it off against that carpet. And then every so often I'll vacuum this carpet. Now if I look at it in the light, if I can get the angle just right, you can see where the surface is flat and dull and where it's shiny. And of course the shiny spots are the low spots. And as I continue to sand, those shiny spots will get smaller and smaller until the entire surface has that flat matte sheen. Okay, so now this surface is quite level, and you might be able to see some witness lines. This is fairly typical when using this type of finish, epoxies or urethane finishes, because each coat sits on top of the previous coat rather than melting in. when you level sand, you can expose witness lines where you're sanding through one coat and into the next coat below it. It leaves a little line of demarcation. However, typically when I buff these on my buffing machine, those witness lines disappear. So I should also mention, when I'm shooting video, I usually won't wear a mask because I can't talk through the mask, but most of the time when I'm sanding, I do wear a KN95 mask so that I don't breathe in the dust that's generated from sanding the epoxy. But another thing I would like to mention is how I deal with these edges. A lot of folks wonder what tips and tricks there are to avoid sanding through on these sort of sharp edges. When it comes to something like around a pocket like this pickup pocket, I usually won't even bother with it, because once I get to the buffing stage and start to buff out the surface, it will all blend in and look just fine. You won't even be able to see anything that would indicate that it wasn't sanded. It's such a narrow, thin strip anyways. But when it comes to edges like this, around contours on the body and beveled edges and that sort of thing, because I'm using a hard wooden block to sand, it doesn't round over the edges. When you're using, however, a flexible rubber as a sanding block, it can tend to round over, and when that happens, you're putting a great deal of sanding force on that sharp edge, and that's why you get sand through. So you always want to use a hard block when you're sanding. Now on some of these areas here where you would normally want to use, you know, your flexible rubber sanding block, what you want to try to do is use a hard block that's cut small so that you can actually use it in an area like this and not get too close to that edge. Leave the edge alone. And then later on, as you're sanding, finishing up the level sanding, you can sand by hand very lightly, just enough to blend this surface to this surface without sanding through. But you have to be very, very careful as you're sanding. You don't want to apply too much pressure or focus in the area too long. Doing so will ensure that you will have sand through. Now, level sanding this type of finish can be really time consuming, but one way that you can speed it up is to sand using a circular sanding stroke. We're taught to always sand in the direction of the grain. However, we're not actually sanding wood here. We're sanding the clear coat that's on top of the wood. So you can go ahead and sand in the circular motion, which is going to remove material faster. Consequently, you can actually start with a finer grit of sandpaper using the circular motion, because you're removing material faster than when you're sanding straight back and forth. Now, you're only going to do this during the initial leveling process because we're trying to remove material quickly to get it level. But then once we move into the polish sanding phase, we're going to use the straight back and forth sanding stroke because we want all of our sanding scratches to be in the same direction. All right, so I have all of the level sanding complete. So I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is to polish sand. That's the process where I'm going to be reducing the 240 grit sanding scratches to 360, then 600, 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, all the way up to 3000 grit. But before I can do that, I have a couple of minor repairs that I need to make first. To begin with, I had decided that these corner tips were too sharp, so I decided to sand them and round them off a little bit, which of course exposes the raw wood. So I need to touch that up there and then up here on this top horn. Then on this back side, if you look closely, you can see where I had some sand through right here, and then again right here. Now, in all honesty, to be perfectly truthful, I did this on purpose because I wanted to show you guys how I would repair this finish, because I know some of you will be interested in how I do that. So I'm going to do that as well. But I also have, and I'm not sure if this will show up on camera, but I have a couple of little divots along this edge right here, and I think there's a couple more here and here, and another one here and another one there. And these divots, unfortunately, I think if I was to try to sand them out, I would end up sanding through the finish. So I'm just going to fill those with some epoxy. But the first thing I need to do is take care of the sand through. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to take some of the dye that I had mixed up when I actually stained the guitar itself, and I'm just going to put some onto a Q-tip, just like that, and then I'll just sort of wipe it on here. Now it will look a lot darker than it actually is because it's wet, and once it's dry it will look fine. In fact, as I let it dry while I'm working here, you can see it starting to lighten up a little bit. Okay, so I'll let that dry for probably 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'm going to come back and put some of the Z-Epoxy finishing resin over the surface of it, and then blend it back into the finish. So I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so I've mixed up just a small amount of the Z-Epoxy, and I'm just going to dab it on with a Q-tip to cover up where I applied the dye. I'll sort of blend it into the surrounding area so that I can sand it and get it smooth, and I won't have to over sand it and recreate the same problem I'm trying to fix. Now once the epoxy has dried, I can then proceed with just lightly sanding where I made the repairs so that it will blend in to the surrounding surface area. Now another tool that I like to use is this Japanese Iwasaka file, and I've got several of these. I use them quite a lot. I've got the larger ones, which I use mostly for woodworking, you know, carving and filing on just the raw wood. But when it comes to like little flaws in a clear coat finish, runs or drips, the 110 millimeter extra fine file works great for taking down those little runs and drips that can form in a finish. Gets the surface perfectly flat. Okay guys, I've got the clear coat level sanded and I've repaired the little spots of sand through. So I'm ready to proceed with the next step, which is to polish sand the surface. I'm going to be taking those 240 grit sanding scratches all the way up to 3000 grit. And from there I can buff it. However, unfortunately this episode's getting a little bit long, so I think what I'll do is I will do the polish sanding in the next episode. So until then, click that thumbs up button, visit eguitarplans.com or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below. Or you can just click the thanks button and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. And until that next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back as I continue to work on this 6-string multi-scale guitar.